I'm Dr. Inckle. I'm currently at the London School of Economics in the Sociology department, and this book is a culmination of a number of years of experience working in health and social care with adults and young people who hurt themselves, conducting academic research, and also running a practitioners training programme, which this book is largely based on. So the first thing to understand about self-injury that's really important is that it's a coping mechanism, and that it's a way that people manage or release or control really intense feelings of distress and difficulty that they have no other way to either externalise or to cope with. In order to really understand self-injury fully, it's quite important to understand the distinctions between both suicide and also self-harm. So first of all, when someone self-injures, they might do that in a range of ways, and the ways that people most commonly think about is cutting themselves or taking overdoses of medication. They're the ones that show up in the statistics most often, but they're not necessarily the most common. But the thing that's then confusing for people around that is those are also means by which sometimes people attempt to end their life or to die by suicide. So people can look at an act of self-injury, which was a coping mechanism, and think that someone was intending to end their life or to die, and that's not true. And that causes a huge amount of distress and confusion for people, because they end up giving a suicide response to someone who was actually coping and had no intention of dying. And so that response can be a complete mismatch with what the person needs. So it's really important to really emphasise that self-injury is a way in which people cope, people manage their difficulty, it's a way that people continue their life. Whereas suicide and attempted suicide happens where people can no longer cope and simply want life to end because it's become utterly unbearable. So the intentions are completely different, but you can't read that off the injury. So you need to be able to ask people what were they feeling or hoping at the time in order to understand the difference. The second important difference is to understand the distinction between self-injury and self-harm. So self-injury is a direct way of coping which involves someone causing immediate pain and injury and damage to their body, as I say, as a way of sort of coping with that difficulty and distress. Whereas self-harm is a range of actions that people might use as coping mechanisms, but which don't necessarily cause that immediate pain or injury to the body. And there are lots of ways that people self-harm. So some of the ones that we commonly think of in terms of coping mechanisms might be using alcohol or drugs, might be using food, either through starving or binging and purging, and so on. And so again, there is a relationship between them all in that they're all coping mechanisms, but again, they're different in terms of the immediacy of them and the kind of responses that are going to be helpful. The other things that I think are important to understand around self-injury is that historically, and to some extent till today, people tend to think that it's something that affects women and girls much more than men and boys. And that's something that's really been challenged by a lot of recent research and data that shows that there's actually more or less parity between male and female self-injury. If there are differences, it tends to be the ways in which people hurt themselves. So it seems that girls and women might cut themselves and take overdose medication more than men and boys, but men and boys are much more likely to hit themselves and to cause bruises, broken bones, fractures, and so on. And again, because very often we only think about self-injury in terms of cutting and overdosing, historically the ways in which men and boys injure themselves has been completely lost or misinterpreted or just seen as accidental. So there really hasn't been attention to male self-injury in the way that there has for females.